It is my honor and privilege to welcome all of you here tonight to hear a fantastic author that we are so excited to have brought to our community. This year at the library, we had a year's worth of programming in remembrance of the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive, and so we consider tonight the highlight of all of that programming. And I certainly would first want to thank our Peters Township Library Foundation. They have worked tirelessly, provided guidance, teamwork, and vision, which really made tonight possible. Also, I would certainly like to thank the staff of the Peters Township Public Library and our Novel November Committee for selling tickets, promoting materials, and answering many, many questions. And speaking of questions, tonight, if you do have questions, we will have a question and answer session, as you see in our program. But there is an index card in each of your program books that we'll be collecting. So as you are listening to the presentation this evening, certainly we encourage you to pass those questions along when the lights come up. I also, speaking of this evening, on your way out, we have a few stops we hope you'll make. We have the Penguin Bookshop that is here as one of our supporters and sponsors. We also have a program called Stockings for Soldiers that if you are so inclined and you'd like to present a gift to some soldiers over the holidays, we have a table of stockings there for you to pick up. Beinhauer Funeral Home will be the ones who will accept those, and they're going to ship those for us. Also in your program booklet, of course, I want to draw your attention to all of our wonderful sponsors this evening, and especially on the last page, because we have donations from a very well-loved member of our community, Mr. Larry Elliott, that we have put towards tonight's program. So to get things started, I would like to first introduce you to our a cappella group here at the high school. They're called Room 100. And they have a very special number prepared. It's called Make It Holy by the Staves.
It's all worn out now, but I never did wrong. No, I never did wrong. Did I ever do you wrong?
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. A little louder? Can you hear me now? Okay. This morning, Tim O'Brien spoke and Room 100 sang again, and I had the unfortunate position of coming on after them twice now because their song makes me cry. So, oh, okay. You can't hear? So tonight I have the privilege of introducing Nick Grimes, who's going to be introducing Tim O'Brien. Nick Grimes is an Afghanistan veteran who served in the Army, and Nick is very, very touched by Tim O'Brien's work. As soon as he heard that Tim O'Brien would be coming tonight, he was on board and has been tremendously helpful in all aspects of organizing our event. We've collaborated with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Nick works for the Veterans Breakfast Club, and with no further ado, I'm going to let Nick tell you what Tim O'Brien's work has meant to him.
Good evening, everyone. It is an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to introduce Tim to you tonight. You have his bio in front of you, so instead of listing all of his accolades and all the great things he's written, I'm just going to share a little bit about personally why Tim's work is so important to me. I served in the Army from 2004 to 2011. I did a couple of tours to Afghanistan to a really brutal province. We saw quite a bit of combat. And I got out of the Army in 2011. And around 2013, I read The Things They Carried for the first time. And as I was reading it, specifically How to Tell a True War Story, I started to cry. And it was for the first time that I was truly able to mourn the friends that I'd lost in combat. No book before or since has helped me to process my experience in the way The Things They Carried has. By blurring the lines between fact and fiction, what is true and false, and more importantly, what is right and wrong, Tim perfectly captures the moral ambiguity of combat. If I had to point to one single paragraph that I'm sure anyone who has ever experienced combat can relate to, it would be the following. In the midst of evil, you want to be a good man. You want decency. You want justice and courtesy and human concord, things you never knew you wanted. At the hour of dusk, you sit at your foxhole and look out on a wide river turning pinkish red and at the mountains beyond. And although in the morning you must cross the river and go into the mountains and do terrible things and maybe die, even so, you find yourself studying the fine colors of the river. You feel wonder and awe at the setting of the sun, and you are filled with a hard, aching love for how the world could be and always should be, but now is not. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tim O'Brien.
I want to start by saying thank you to you for being here, to the library for having me, to Nick, who has become a good friend in one day. We share so much. I want to say thank you to the high school singers. Weren't they unbelievable? I've heard them twice today. Earlier at the high school where we are now, in the same room, and then again in the same room tonight. And on both occasions, I felt I was in the presence of incredible talent and beauty and joy. It felt as if a whole symphony had been made by these voices. Didn't it to you? That you were hearing violins and trumpets and drums. They're just totally amazing. It's been a great, I've only been here for one day, but it's been a memorable experience that I'll never forget. So thank you all. I am not a public speaker. I'm a writer. I spend my time alone in a room, in my underwear, writing stories. I do not like leaving the house, and I find any reason I can to avoid it. Send my wife for groceries, my kids, even though they're 15 and 12, send them and get in the car and go get me cigarettes and all that. I do not leave. And I'm not a speech giver. And yet tonight I'm kind of called upon to do that. But I'm not capable of giving a real speech. I'm a fiction writer, a storyteller, both as my job, but also in my heart. And I'm a big believer in the power of stories in our lives, the stories we tell ourselves late at night when you're lying in bed and about your own life, the things you wish you had done differently or better or in some other way. The stories you hear in school and Sunday school, the stories you hear from your neighbors. Stories are a way of connecting us, partly to ourselves and partly to the rest of the world. If you like a book or you like a story and you really are into reading it, you find yourself part of the book, rooting for characters and hoping for miracles, that a very sad old piano teacher in Dublin will somehow find happiness, even though the odds look terrible. And you sort of become that piano teacher. Stories console us, stories can help us heal, stories can embolden us and give us courage. I believe in them. And so what I want to do tonight, as opposed to delivering some kind of lecture, which I'm incapable of doing anyway, I thought I would do what I do best, which is try to tell you a few stories in the hope that my underlying message to you will soak through the way it always does in stories. It's not going to be specific wisdom and how to live your life or how to vote when you go to vote and things like that, but rather just to listen to stories. Ultimately, a story is aimed not just at your head, at your brain, but it's aimed at your tear ducts and at your stomach, the pit of your stomach, and it's aimed at the nape of your neck and the back of your throat. It's aimed at the whole human being and not just the brain, the way most nonfiction is. I want to begin by, not in Vietnam, but I want to begin here at home fairly recently. I received a letter about, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that, from a 26-year-old elementary school teacher in my home state of Minnesota. And I want to just paraphrase the letter for you. I used to read aloud from this letter when I visited colleges and high schools and so on. And one day in Chicago, it just blew out of my hands. It went scampering down Michigan Avenue. But I still have a pretty good recollection of that letter. I don't remember it exactly. Some of it I do remember exactly. But most of it I remember kind of the way I remember Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and seeing it. I don't remember exactly what happened, but the feel of it I remember. So a letter arrived. It was a long letter, maybe 50 pages or so, handwritten on both sides, so the equivalent of 100 pages. A long, and I'm not going to summarize it all for you. It began, "Dear Mr. O'Brien, I've been wanting to write you for a long time, but now I feel I have to." She said, "I need to tell you about growing up in my house in a suburb outside Minneapolis." She said, "When I was 7, 8 years old, I was terrified of going to the dinner table. That when I did go to the table at night, my dad and my mom would sit at the table, and neither one of them would speak. They'd look down at their plates, especially my dad, and just stare at his plate and eat his meal. He said I could see the cords in his neck stiffening up and his face kind of going red. He looked angry. He looked sad. But I'm 7 years old, and I don't know what's going on in my own house." She said the tensions in the house began to build and build as she got older, and she had no idea what it was about. One day, and I'm now on I've skipped a lot of detail, but one day she said, when I was in 7th grade, I went into the basement to look for something, and under a cot in the basement, I found a small cigar box and took it out and looked in it. And inside the box, she found relics of her father's history. She found old faded Kodachrome snapshots of her dad in a uniform in some foreign place. Vietnam, she didn't know then, but she found dented cartridge casings, a couple of those. She found some medals, because her father had won in some war. She found a stripper's bra, a kind of tassel thing that I guess her father had gotten at some floor show in Vietnam. A whole mixture of a P-38 can opener, a relic that many Vietnam veterans carry to this day. And as she looked into the box as a 7th grader, she realized for the first time that her father had been on a war. Her mother hadn't talked about it, and he hadn't talked about it, and she learned about it by looking into a cigar box. On the way up the stairs, after seeing this, she said she passed her father coming down the stairs. And she said, "Were you in a war?" And her father looked at her and started to say something, but then stopped and continued down the basement. I'm now on page, 15 or 17 of this letter. She got older, and she said by the time she had become a 9th grader, she felt more like a counselor than a daughter. She said the tensions between her mom and dad, they were so thick you could take a steak knife and just cut the thickness at that dinner table at night. She still wasn't really conscious of what the underlying problem was, but she knew it had something to do with her dad's silence, something to do with her mom's silence, and something to do with a war she knew nothing about. And she was too afraid to ask by this point. At one point, when she was now in her early high school years, she said her mom was vacuuming the rug in the living room. And the girl was sitting doing something in a sofa. And her mom turned off the vacuum, turned to the girl and said, "You know, I've never really loved your father. And the girl said, what? Why did you marry him if you don't love him? And the mother said, I married him out of pity. We'd had a couple of dates in college, and he'd gone off to Vietnam and came home this silent, angry, sad man. And then the mother said, how do you love somebody who won't talk to you? Near the end of her letter, age 40 or so, she said, I grew up and I got into my final year of high school. And one day in my English class, AP English class, we were assigned the things they carried, the book. And she brought it home and to study it, basically, to read it for a class. And had left it lying on a coffee table in the living room. Her dad saw it passing through and opened it up and read a few pages, very few, couple pages. Begins, as you know, if you've read the book, you know it begins with the lists of the things that soldiers carry. And then goes into the emotions that soldiers carry later in that first chapter. But it begins with just the physical stuff that soldiers carry to give you a sense of the weight, just the physical weight that's borne through a war by anyone who's a combat soldier, and how that weight gets oppressive and begins to push you into the earth. On average, we'd carry somewhere, in my company, we'd carry anywhere from 70 to 80 pounds of stuff. At any given time, sea rations and water, like 5 canteens. It was so hot. I carried a radio, a rifle, bandoliers of ammunition, and you just pile on the stuff. And the father had read this. And that night at the dinner table, he said a couple of things about just the list. It wasn't about anything emotional at that point, just the stuff. And the mother said something back, and that was the end of it. The next day, the father read a little more, and that night at the table, he said a little more. And the mother said something, and this went on for 2 weeks or so. And the woman who wrote me, now a woman, 26 years old, ended her letter by saying, a conversation began by the fortuity of a book lying on a coffee table. And it hasn't ended yet. We're still talking. My mom and dad are talking. She said, that book didn't save them. They've still got big trouble. But they wouldn't be together, I think, if that book hadn't been lying there that day. At the end of the letter, all she said was, I don't really know why I felt I had to write you, except to say thanks. But the problem, of course, for me was I didn't know this family. I didn't know the people involved, and I didn't write the book to help them. I wrote the book to help me and to help my children, to somehow take an axe to the frozen sea inside me and chop it with a book, to make myself speak, if only on the page. I, like that father, have had silences and still have them through my life. This is extremely difficult, speaking even right now. It's hard not to choke up, and it's hard not to feel pain and memory. One lesson from this story that I hope will endure at least this much is that wars do not end when you sign peace treaties. They don't end when everybody comes home and the fighting stops. They go on and on and on and on. Not just in the lives of soldiers or former soldiers, but in the lives of their children and their wives and their moms and dads and their friends and the people they work with. They go on until who knows when they end. At least until my children are gone and dead, and probably their children are gone. They echo on through our lives, including a lot of people in this room whom I've met maybe an hour or so ago. We live under the illusion that once the war is over, that's it, and get back and put yourself in shape and make yourself happy and go on with your life, but it's not that easy. You shouldn't even forget it. I mean, we're told, put it behind you and so on. But that's like telling the people at Auschwitz, put it behind you, go ahead. You don't forget, and you shouldn't. You should remember. But there's a price to be paid for remembering. And the price is a painful one. It has to be paid, and it is paid. I started here tonight intentionally. I tried to start in your lives, not in a war, but rather the consequences of a war and how it ripples through families in all kinds of insidious ways, and certainly through my own life. The second little story I want to tell you is based on a story in The Things They Carried. It's impossible to talk about an entire book, so I picked one tiny little chapter to talk about in the hope that it would be about the whole, it'd feel like I was talking about the whole book in one way or another. And what I'm going to do is, even though many of you have read this chapter, I'm going to read it aloud. It'll only take me 4 minutes or 5 minutes. And then I want to talk to you about it, why it was written, and where it was born in my own life, and then in the lives of my friends who served with me in Vietnam, but also how it's echoed over into the lives of my children. This little thing is called Ambush. When she was 9, my daughter, Kathleen, asked if I'd ever killed anyone. She knew about the war. She knew I'd been a soldier. "You keep writing these war stories," she said, "so I guess you must have killed somebody." It was a hard moment, but I did what seemed right, which was to say, "Of course not," and then to take her on my lap and just hold her for a while. Someday, I hope, she'll ask again. But here, right now, I want to pretend she's a grown-up. I want to tell her exactly what happened, or what I remember happening. And then I want to say to her that as a little girl, she was absolutely right. This is why I keep telling war stories. He was a short, slender young man of about 20. I was afraid of him, afraid of something. And as he passed me on the trail, I threw a grenade that landed at his feet and killed him. Or to go back. Shortly after midnight, we moved into the ambush site outside a little village called Mike. The whole platoon was there, maybe 30 of us, lined up in the dense brush alongside the trail. And for 5 hours, nothing at all happened. We were working in 2-man teams, one man on guard while the others slept, switching off every 2 hours. And I remember it was still dark when my friend Kiowa shook me awake for the final watch. The night was foggy and hot. For the first few moments, I felt lost, not sure about directions, pitch black, groping for my helmet, my weapon, And then I reached out and found 3 grenades and lined them up in front of me. The pins had already been straightened for quick throwing. And then, for maybe half an hour, I kneeled there in the dark and just waited. Very gradually, tiny slivers, dawn began to break through the morning fog. And from my position in the brush, I could see 10 or 15 meters up the trail. The mosquitoes were fierce. I remember slapping at them, wondering if I should wake up Kiowa and ask for some mosquito repellent, and then thinking that was a bad idea, and then looking up and seeing the young man come out of the morning fog. He wore black clothing, rubber sandals, and a gray ammunition belt. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side as if listening for something. He seemed at ease. He carried his weapon in one hand, muzzle down, moving without any hurry up the center of the trail. There was no sound at all, none that I can remember. And in a way, it seemed he was part of the morning fog, or part of my own imagination. But there was also the reality of what was happening in my stomach. I had already pulled the pin on the grenade. I had come up to a crouch. It was entirely automatic. I did not hate the young man. I did not see him as the enemy. I did not ponder issues of morality or politics or military duty. I crouched and kept my head down. I tried to swallow whatever was rising from my stomach, which tasted like lemonade, something fruity and sour. I was terrified. There were no thoughts about killing. The grenade was to make him go away, just evaporate. And I leaned back and felt my head go empty and then felt it fill up again. I had already thrown the grenade before telling myself to throw it. It was gone. The brush was thick, and I had to lob it high, not aiming. And I remember that grenade seeming to freeze above me for just an instant, as if a camera had clicked. I can see it right now. It froze in midair, or so it seemed. And then I remember ducking down and holding my breath and seeing little wisps of fog rise from the earth. The grenade bounced once and rolled across the trail. I did not hear it, but there must have been a sound, because the young man dropped his weapon and began to run. Just 2-3 quick steps. Then he stopped, turned to his right, looked down at the grenade, and tried to cover his head, but never did. It occurred to me then that he was about to die. I wanted to warn him. The grenade made a popping noise. Not soft, but not loud either, not what you'd expect. And there was a puff of dust and smoke, a small white puff. And the young man seemed to jerk upward, as if pulled by invisible wires. He fell on his back. His rubber sandals had been blown off. He lay at the center of the trail, his right leg bent beneath him, his one eye shut, his other eye, a huge star-shaped hole. For me, it was not a matter of live or die. I was in no real danger. Almost certainly, the young man would have passed me by. And it will always be that way. Later, I remember my friend Kiowa tried to tell me that the man would have died anyway. He told me it was a good kill. He told me I was a soldier. This was a war. That I should shape up and stop staring and ask myself what the dead man would have done if things were reversed. But you see, none of that mattered. The words were way too complicated. All I could do was gape at the fact of the dead man's body. Even now, 5 decades later, I haven't finished sorting it out. Sometimes I forgive myself. Other times I don't. In the ordinary hours of life, I try not to think about it. But now and then, when I'm reading a newspaper or just sitting alone in a room, I'll look up and I'll see the young man step out of the morning fog. I'll watch him walk toward me, his shoulders slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side, and he will pass within a few yards of me and suddenly smile at some secret thought and then continue up the trail to where it bends back into the morning fog. Well, why do I choose this passage of this book to talk about tonight? There are a bunch of reasons. One is it didn't happen. Not that way. No young man, no hand grenade, no trail. It's made up. But it comes out of dozens and dozens of ambushes and dozens of deaths, much like it. It's a way of taking a lot of Vietnam and a lot of ambushes and a lot of dead people and a lot of guilt and a lot of horror and putting it into 5 pages and letting that be the war inside the things they carried. There's not much killing that goes on in this book, and intentionally so. So, I'm addressing in a way one issue that a lot of, especially college and high school students wrestle with. How much is true, and why did you not just tell the truth about everything? And there are times when you're dealing with a year of combat or dealing with 10 years of marriage or 20 years of living with your father, subjects where you can't tell it all, so you compress it and you make things up and you try to be faithful to the general feel of things by compression. The second reason I talk about this story tonight is it's about the ultimate and final reality of war, any war. We ought to change the word war, like get rid of it, wipe it out of the dictionaries and wipe it out of all the speeches and wipe it out of the Constitution and wipe it out of the Gettysburg Address and wipe it out of Winston Churchill's speeches, wipe it out of all the histories, and instead replace it with killing people, including children. And if Congress had to declare a killing people, including children, it might be a little harder to do. Why put our heads in the sand? That's what it is, isn't it? That's what war is, not killing goldfish or gerbils. It's killing people. That's what wars are. The ultimate reality of war, whether it's a righteous war or a bad war or a war in between, they're all about that. And this story tonight was meant to sort of call attention to one single death and to linger it over for just a little while, a few pages. Because ordinarily what we do get when we receive headlines or news stories from Afghanistan, where Nick served, or Iraq, the most you usually get is 6 guys died today by an IED that went off in Baghdad or Kabul or wherever, and that's it. You get a number and you get the deaths, but you don't feel anything and you don't linger over it. You certainly don't have to look at the bodies, the star-shaped hole. Those are all, America, we cleanse all that. We put Ajax on the war, and you don't have to look at it, just support the war. And it's a way of just calling attention to what every person who's been in a war knows, that's what it's about, killing people. And so I wanted to put that, and that's what a soldier has to live with all those years later. You can live with it pridefully, thinking you did the right thing, or you can live with it with guilt and all kinds of other ways. And not only you have to live with it, so do your children, and so does your wife, and so does your mother and father. All have to live with it. Another reason that I wanted to just talk for a little bit about that story tonight is it has to do with why the book was written in the first place. As you could tell as I was reading it just now, it's hard to do. I don't like doing it. And I don't like dwelling on bad stuff. But I feel that if I don't do it, something that's going to freeze inside me again, the way it had for years after coming back from the war. And I don't want that freeze to happen again. And by confronting it in front of you tonight, it's a way of confronting it myself. It's personal. And I want to tell you now why it's personal. I mentioned earlier there were dozens of ambushes like this. Basically all we did at night. We would go out and ambush. That was our job at night. But there was one ambush in particular that was the source of the story and what it was born out of. And I want to tell you a little bit about it. It was not a classic ambush. Ambushes usually were, a squad of, 12 guys or sometimes a platoon. But rarely was it a company. 100 people don't usually do ambushes. But on a certain night in July of 1969, the lieutenants, we were working as a company. We were encamped on a hill. And it was the middle of the night, maybe 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. And our lieutenants woke us up. So we're going out on an ambush, the whole company. This was really rare. And what we did, we saddled up in the dark and put on all our stuff and grabbed our weapons, and we began traipsing off this hill, down it, and then off into the Vietnam dark. Vietnam dark is hard to describe to you. It's black. In Quang Ngai province, where I served, there were no street lights. There was no electricity in these villages at all. And if there wasn't a moon and some stars, it was very easy to get lost, just like separated from your own guys. And so part of the terror of just leaving the hill was the terror of walking through the dark, a little boy terror, that little monster in the closet terror that we've gone through, all of us at some point, and it's the fear of what's out there. On top of that, there was danger out there. It was the middle of a war zone. And it was a war zone populated not just by enemy soldiers, but by, in our case, landmines. That did most of the killing to my company. I'd say 80, 85% of our casualties. came from landmines, which even today, 50 years later, are still blowing people up, especially children. So you're afraid of that. We walked through the Vietnam dark for, I don't know, almost 2 hours, maybe a little more than that, 2.5 hours. And eventually came to a small village. The village in total was maybe as big as this whole auditorium, or maybe slightly bigger, but not big. It was entirely encased in hedgerows and bamboo and banana trees. You couldn't really see any huts, or hooches as we called them. And it was pitch black on top of it. The idea was to encircle the village. Apparently intelligence had come in, which is a misnomer for anybody who's been in the Army. There was no intelligence. You know, it's the opposite. There was dumbness. But the intelligence was there going to be VC in this village. And the idea was to encircle the village, and then at sunrise, 3 platoons, most of our company, would press through the village and drive the Viet Cong out into a rice paddy where my platoon was lined up along a paddy dike. And the idea was to drive them out and kill them out in the rice paddy. Well, these things never worked, these operations. I mean, they heard us coming from, a trillion miles away. We were loud, dumb, young. We had all this stuff clanking on our bodies. They certainly had people, watching that hill we'd encamped on earlier. They knew we were moving off of it. And these things just never worked. But this night, one time, it kind of did. At about, 4:30, just as you could see right over the horizon, a little bit of violet. It wasn't pitch black anymore. Our platoons began moving into the village. And I remember as vividly as I can see any of you right now, I can remember that strip of violet over the horizon and a little pinkish thing happening. Not a lot, but just a little tinge of pink. And the village was off to my right, and here's our paddy dike, and the idea is to drive them into a rice paddy out here, right in front of us. And it worked. God knows how, but it did. Is that pink, right across that pink, purple strip of light. It wasn't dawn yet. It was right before dawn. You could see 3 silhouettes going across as far away as the front row of this audience, really close, like 10 meters, maybe 8, maybe 12, somewhere in there, but really close. And they were silhouetted against that strip of purple. It was like being at a carnival with those ducks going by, and you're popping away at them. Well, there were 30 of us, and we opened up with everything that American arsenals deliver to a soldier. M16 automatic fire, M60 fire, machine gun fire, hand grenades. We'd set up claymores. We had these M79 grenade launchers. We gave them what technology from our industry gave us to give, and they received all of it. And they received it, these 3 figures that close. At full light, which was 20 minutes later, we went out into the 10 yards away. I didn't. I stayed back. By that point, I'd seen enough death. I didn't want to look at it anymore. But our company commander went out and a couple of other guys, and they found one dead body. A young guy, maybe 17, 16, sort of like the guy I wrote about in this story. He was riddled with bullets, but there were no other corpses. Remember, there were 3 of them. How we missed the other 2 is beyond belief. It seems impossible. They were saved by some miracle or by our own terror that we just fired too high. That's one of the things in combat. You are so afraid of dying yourself that you don't aim carefully the way they do in the movies. You just let it rock and roll, hoping that they won't kill you before you kill them. But it's not like taking aim. For the rest of my life, I never looked at that corpse closely. I sort of looked at it obliquely out of the corner of my eye. But like the character in my story, I still bear with me sense of responsibility. I will never know if a bullet from my weapon struck that young man. In fact, man is the wrong word. He was a kid. He was the enemy, for sure. There was a weapon lying there. But it's hard going to sleep some nights, maybe most nights, without the thought going through my head that, did I kill that kid? Or did I help kill him with a bullet? And the answer has to be yes. I was there. I pulled the trigger. I was in Vietnam. I was a soldier. I was in a war. And you can't absolve yourself of responsibility by saying, I don't know. That's cowardly. You have to take the responsibility, and it's a hard one to take. But in this story, for the first time, I talked about that axe on the frozen sea. It was my way of trying to assume personal responsibility for the death of somebody else. And it's a necessary way of making yourself be honest with yourself about the things you've done in your life. It's so easy to make up excuses and blame Uncle Sam and Ho Chi Minh and Jane Fonda. Blame everybody but yourself. And that can lead to big trouble among a lot of veterans, where you find everybody to blame but yourself. You blame your company commander. You blame your unfaithful wife. You blame the old man who forgot to vote in Sioux City, Iowa. You blame the Statue of Liberty. You blame general. You find everything but yourself. But ultimately, each of us make our decisions, whether we go to war and kill people or we don't. And that was my way of trying to take some responsibility for my time in Vietnam. Okay, the last little thing I want to mention, and then I'm almost over the part that I was terrified of doing as I was standing over here. I like answering questions and responding to what you have to say a lot more than doing what I've just finished doing. It's a lot less painful and more fun. But there's one more thing I do want to bring up. How do I begin this? It's about another death, which is, again, is the reality of war. For some reason, we don't like talking about death in war. It sort of embarrasses us. And why don't you talk about patriotic stuff and service to country and sacrifice and all that? But for a combat soldier, those things are trivial and almost meaningless. I mean, you do take pride, and there is sacrifice, but what you live with late at night is your memories, the things you did well and badly, the things you're embarrassed by. And this is a memory that will also be with me forever. There are two memories side by side. One is of a photograph that I have in my office drawer, and it's of Tim O'Brien, a young version of myself, all those decades ago. And I'm got my rifle slung over my shoulder, and I'm squatting down in front of a Vietnamese hooch, and with me is a little girl, maybe 8 years old, 7 years old, and we're both smiling at the camera. I just finished a new book, and this picture is going to be in the book. It's a real picture. It's not made up. If you buy the book or check it out at the library, you'll see it. But living side by side with that picture is another one, which is a picture in my head that will never go away. This also happened in July of 1969, a terrible month for Alpha Company. We were crossing. There was a paddy, great big paddy, off maybe 100 yards in depth and maybe 300 yards long. It was a big rice paddy. And we were walking alongside it, heading that way, and the paddy's off to our left. And along the side of the rice paddy, it was all brush and bamboo stuff. It was, so you could see across the paddy, and then dense brush. And then directly ahead of us, it was also dense brush and bamboo. So we're sort of like an L, and we're kind of in the middle of all this. And it's a beautiful, beautiful sunny day with white clouds, and if for once not god-awful hot. It was not cool, but it wasn't, broiling hot. And the day was getting close to being over. We were going to soon encamp and dig our foxholes and get ready for the night. So the day what had been a hard day was almost over. And suddenly the world exploded. Gunfire coming from over there and from over there. It was not just it was automatic gunfire. It was partly, AKs, but at least one machine gun, and I think two of them, but I know for sure one. And on top of that, RPG fire. It's tough talking to civilians. That's a word. RPG is short for rocket propelled grenade. It's a thing you hold on your shoulder. You squeeze this lever, and this single big explosive round comes out. It was not an accurate weapon. It would sort of go like this. So you didn't know where it was going to hit. There was no way you could duck because it didn't go straight. All this stuff coming in. People screaming and yelling, and of course we began firing back in that direction and that direction. This went on for not long. I'd say 5 minutes at the most, and then it sort of ended the way a rain ends, not abruptly, but petering out, a little lighter and a little lighter and a little lighter. And then the dead silence that any combat veteran will talk about after a thing like this. The world seems to have lost its capacity for sound. It's like the sound is sucked out. Everything is dead quiet. No birds, no talk. For 20 seconds or so? And you sort of begin to repair yourself. The terror, and you straighten up, and you look at your buddies, and surprised that you're alive, surprised that they're alive, surprised that there's still a world. It's a feeling of waking up from a dense, terrible dream. And you all know what that's like. There's a moment of stunness. And then you go to the refrigerator and you get a glass of orange juice, and it sort of gradually goes away. At the end of this 5-minute horrible firefight, we realized that nobody had been hurt. Not a single scratch on any of us, which is amazing. It's a little bit like those 3 guys right 10 yards away. We've all missed 2 of them. And we were astonished by that, and we were happy, and thought, God, were we lucky. And we walked across the patio, and we were going to go to this hedgerow in front of us to see if any Viet Cong had been killed. And on the way across the patio, as close to me as the floor right there, I walked by a little girl of 9, 8, somewhere in there, dead. Her face had been blown away on this side. There was no face left there. And one eye was open, opaque and dead, and staring at God. She was the only casualty that day in that huge firefight, a little girl of 8. Well, what do you say to yourself when you see that? You're 22 years old, as I was. And one of the things I said was, well, the world must be a better place, right? Now it's a better place. Because that's what wars are for, right? Make the world better. That's why we fight them. We don't fight them to make the world worse. Defend our freedom, stop the commies from invading Seattle. Defend American honor, make it better. Stop the communists. That's the idea of war. That's why we do it, make the world better. But as a 22-year-old kid looking down at that body, the world didn't feel better. Felt like I had made it worse by being part of it, and that maybe all of us do when we start killing people. I felt that I had dipped my soul in evil, and take it out again. And I can tell you that most combat vets will tell you that's kind of the feeling. You know you're doing something evil, even if it's a good war or so-called good war. It's still bad to kill people, and especially when you have little girls, who are totally innocent die. She was caught between two armies, and she was the only casualty. Well, there's one lesson in this, and the only lesson that makes any sense to me all these years later is that a bullet can kill the enemy. That is for sure. But it's also true that a bullet can manufacture an enemy, and that's just as true. Because if that bullet strikes your kid in the head and kills your kid, whoever shot that bullet is your enemy. You're full of hatred and anger and despair and grief that will last for the day you die. It'll always be there. If either of my boys were shot in the head by, the Taliban, they'd have one hell of an enemy. Or by a member of our National Guard here, or by you. I'd be your enemy. Bullets can do that. And we remember one half of the equation, but we totally forget the other half of the equation, which we all know is true. As parents and as human beings, you know how you're going to feel in the moments. It's going to be partly grief, it's going to be partly rage, maybe even rage at God on top of it all, or at fate, or whatever we call what causes the deaths of young kids. I want to stop almost now. I got just one little thing I want to add to this. There's no lesson in this. I don't mean to be anti-war, pro-war. I mean to talk about the emotions that I experienced in a war, and to allow myself to sort of dredge it out for you and let you in on what keeps me awake late at night and why I too fall silent at the dinner table. My kids call it Dad's bad time when it comes back in a way that is hard to deal with. And I deal with it by going quiet, as a lot of veterans do. You've heard now, and I'm done, but you've heard Tim's bad time in 3 different stories. The girl writing the letter about her parents and so on, and the story of the ambush, and the story of this little girl in a rice paddy. Before I came up here, I was overwhelmed. Like, how do you talk about a year of your life in 40 minutes or whatever it's been, and keep people interested, and you feel like you're not even doing justice to this huge topic of war that we're dealing with even today, even though we tend to push it aside and play Grand Theft Auto when guys on the other side of the world are going through kind of what I went through. The war in Afghanistan's still going on, though you don't read about it much, do you? And there are people doing the things that I just talked to you about. I want to thank you again all for coming, and thank you for the hospitality and the real warmth and friendship I found here. It's been just an amazing experience. I made friends with people in the library, with Nick, and a lot of people I met just tonight, like an hour before I began talking. So it's been a great experience, and thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you. So there's this is the part I like best. This is a Q&A thing. You got the Q's, but I don't have a lot of A's. I mean, there's not a lot that all I know is my heart, and I'm not the kind of guy that can sort of overanalyze it, but I'll do my best to respond. Sorry. Right? Oh, we're collecting those little tickets, right? Oh, I forgot that. Okay.
While we're still collecting them, I'll go ahead and start with one. One on top is pretty good. All right, your books are not linear. How do you decide on an order of events, and what does your revision process look like?
The books aren't linear. Some of them are, but the things they carried is not, and most of them aren't. They aren't linear because my life isn't. The world doesn't come at me. When I look back on my life, I don't remember what happened first, second, third, fourth. And if I were to ask any of you about, say, yesterday, you're going to have some trouble putting things in order. And if I ask you about 2 weeks ago, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And if I ask you who started that fight with your wife, last January, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Even remembering the content of the fight, much less, you probably remember the ferocity of it, and that's it. That the world, although we live it in a chronological, linear way, we don't remember it that way. At least I don't. I remember the world in clumps, sort of the way I talk tonight. I remember that 5-minute firefight. I remember nothing about what preceded it, nothing about what followed it. And I think I don't trust linearity, at least with me, because I don't remember it. I remember chunks of this and chunks of that. I think that's true for all of us. If I look back on my college years, I'll remember that person or that event, but can't place it in a sophomore year, junior year. Sometimes I can, but not much. And what happened first, second, and third? In a way, it's irrelevant. A good story, I think, should feel timeless. It should feel, if you're reading the Red Badge of Courage, the Civil War is now. It wasn't, all those years ago. It's now when you're reading about Henry Fleming in battle in that book. When you're into the pages of the book, you're not thinking what happened first, second, third. And that book, by the way, captures something of what I'm talking about the chaos and that surreality, that surreal feel of being in a war. And that was done before surrealism even existed, and yet it was done beautifully. So the war doesn't come after me that way. Revision is endless. I finished a book, I thought, in Paris about somewhere in the middle of the summer. I came back and I read it again and thought, oh God, it's not good enough. And so I did it again and again. I'd been working on it 10 years, and most of the 10 years have been spent in revision, doing it over and and it's all kinds of things are involved. The music of language matters to me. I try to keep it Midwestern and normal, kind of like how you speak in Pittsburgh, and not highfalutin and elevated, and yet trying to make it fresh. So I haven't taken it off a Walmart shelf, or some book I read last week, to make it my own. And that's a lot of work. For me to write a page of even passable prose, just like mediocre, like okay, takes a week, sometimes more than that. And then you work on it for another month, and then you end up throwing it away, totally, completely, for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't fit the book. Books have to have rhythm and pace. You can't go on forever. And, you got to sort of, life is like that. It's got edges, and you got to move it. So it's an endless revision process. I'm still doing it, even though I thought the book was finished a long time ago. It's not a book about war. It's a book about being an old father and how your own mortality, in 20 years I'll be dead. And in 20 years my kids aren't going to have a father. And that would have been painful to me as a kid, and that certainty and that knowledge. And so it's a book giving my kids the last-minute love in different ways, telling stories of their lives, and stories about their father and their mother and how we met, stories about being a writer, things like that. Book very close to my heart. I think it's my best book. I hope it is, because God knows I worked on it hard enough. But it's been an endless process of revision. It begins with your heart, but then you have to be cold about it and and sentences have to be hard. Even if the subject is sentimental, the sentences can't come out of a Walmart card or a Hallmark card or one of these. They've got to have a hardness to them so that it doesn't feel saccharine and sugary and all the rest of the dangers that a writer faces. So it's an endless process, word by word. It'll drive you nuts. Anybody who would intentionally become a writer, you ought to lock them up. I mean, they're nuts because it's endless subjectivity. So you write a masterpiece and some asshole at the university says, that's a terrible book. And some other critic loves the book for stupid reasons, and then you hate that even more. And then your wife says, well, I don't think it's that great. And then you get really depressed. And then your kids say, I don't even want to read it. And then you get really depressed. So it's totally, all this subjectivity stuff goes on. I'd rather lay tile for a living, where you lay it, it's laid, and nobody can argue. Look at it. There it is. It's on the floor. You can't argue with me. So only if you're a big pain freak, become a writer, because it's man, I wish I'd stuck to baseball.
Okay, here's a question that comes up at the Veterans Breakfast Club with young veterans a lot. How do you respond when someone says, thank you for your service?
Oh, God, that one's going to be tough. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I have a good friend. I'll answer it obliquely. His name's Larry Heinemann. He wrote a book called Paco's Story that won the National Book Award. It's a book about doing dishes. That's how Larry describes his book. I mean, it's really a book about a guy home from a war, working in a restaurant, doing dishes, and all the silence that he carries. Kind of the stuff I was talking about earlier. It's a brilliant book. It's so beautiful. It's a war story with no war in it. It's the aftermath of war. And Larry and I were talking about that question one day. And he said, well, the problem is it's become a catchphrase. And so it doesn't feel very original and therefore not very from the heart. And I said, well, yeah, but people are just trying to be kind. And he said, yeah, and I'm kind back to them. I say, no. What Larry's always says, I say, no need for thanks. That's Larry's word. By that he means you don't necessarily thank somebody for killing for you. Thank you for killing people for me. Or thank you at least for trying to kill people for me. That's a little awkward as a locution, isn't it? And it's sort of shorthand, I guess is what Larry was getting at. It's a shorthand for avoidance of the nastiness that is war, that we find so many ways to put our heads in the sand and refuse to look at it. And I think he feels it's a little like that. He said, but one of the things Larry said, I hear, thank you for your service, and it feels like they can't wait to get back to the Packers game or to Grand Theft Auto. They can't wait to get away from it, as if that's sufficient. And he says, I know it's meant kindly. We were sort of arguing about this. I was arguing on behalf of those who say it. It's meant in a good spirit. But I do see his point. And I'm more and more kind of leaning toward it. It does have that Walmart or Hallmark card feeling. Instead of really saying what I think to your wife, I'll just give her this word somebody else wrote, and I'll give that to her. And when I do that to my wife, she just stares at me like, do something real. You're a fucking writer. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean that. I apologize, Pittsburgh. That's Vietnam talking. And more on. I didn't mean to do it. It just came out. Wherever you are.
All right, the next one. Did you really lose a childhood friend like Linda?
Yes. She was more than a friend. She was the love of my life. Even granted, I was in 3rd grade and 4th grade. But this is so hard to talk about. I had my first date with her in 4th grade, and it was a double date with my mom and dad. we'd, she loved me and I loved her, even though we were young. It's hard to describe. It was as real as any other love I felt since then. And it was not yet corrupted by betrayal and loss and all the horrible things that can happen. We call it puppy love or child love, but this was love. It was a real deal. Or so it seemed to both of us, I think. We knew we were in love because we never said anything to each other. Not on that date. We sat on a whole date together. Sat right next to them. We never spoke to each other. That's how you know you're in love when you're in 4th grade. If you don't love somebody, you talk to them, you don't care. And then in the end of 4th grade, she contracted a brain tumor. Her real name was Lorna Lou Moeller. She went up to the Mayo Clinic and had exploratory surgery. She had her head cut open, and they went in, and it was hopeless. They sewed her up. And she came back to 4th grade wearing a little cap to cover the baldness. They had to shave her head. And the event that I describe in the book of this the kind of bully kid in 4th grade pulled the hat off of her, and there were all these stitches going, 2 rows of them going down, and big black things, and baldness. And I remember her turning and looking at me when he did that. And what she meant by the look, I have no idea. But it was sort of like, well, what do you say back? He was like, well. And then she died about 7 months later. The same kid came up to me on the playground, the school playground, and said, your girlfriend, she kicked the bucket. And then my dad later on took me to the funeral home, and I looked at her dead body, and she looked dead. She didn't look alive anymore. The mortician had apparently pumped her too full of embalming fluid. She was bloated. She was a little skinny thing. And so I published that chapter originally in Esquire. This is going to be really hard to talk about, but her mother had left Worthington. This girl's father had died in my hometown. She'd moved to Arizona. Years and years had gone by, 30 years. And she was living in an old folks' home in either Tucson or Phoenix. And she went to the dentist one day, and there on the table lay Esquire, and she knew my name from Worthington, and she picked it up and started reading, and right away, there's her daughter, who's been dead for, at that point, like 30, 35 years, a long time. And she's on the pages of the story. She's talking, and she's alive in the story, even though her body's dead. There was something there. She left the dentist's office. She went home. She wrote a letter to me that was written on, back then, on this computer paper that was perforated. It was a long, just this long bunch of paper stuffed into a great big manila envelope, in which she said, basically, I thought that I was the last person on the planet to remember this little girl. My husband's dead, her sister's dead, all our relatives are. I'm in an old folks' home. I'm going to die soon, and once I'm gone, it will be as if Lorna Lou had never lived. She'll be erased from memory. And then you read a story where your little girl is present, her beauty, her Spanish noir skin, and her black, dark, beautiful hair, the light in her eyes, and the way she spoke in the story. It's not her body. She was dead. But there was something that moved that mother to feel that she'd encountered in some way the spirit of her daughter. And that's one of the joys of storytelling. It's the joy of breathing life into the dead. Even if the dead aren't even dead yet, they will be. So my buddies in Vietnam, you're trying to breathe life into them. My dad, an alcoholic, now long gone, trying to breathe life into him through fiction and storytelling. It's a way, there's a line in the things they carried, stories can save us. And that means not our bodies, but they can save something which is absolute and enduring in the human spirit. It's the light you see in your own eyes when you look into a mirror. You see it's the you-ness. And the story can somehow make you feel that when you read about Huck Finn. You're with Huck, and you're on that raft, and there's an aliveness with you. So that's the answer to that question.
You are now a consultant for the popular TV series This Is Us, and I don't know if you've contributed writing to that series, but the question is, how does that differ from your other writing, your other work?
Well, I have contributed. I wrote, I don't know, the 4th episode this season. I co-wrote it, and then I wrote another one that'll be on in a couple of weeks. So they're filming, I think, right now. They're starting to. And then I'm a consultant in the sense of kind of Vietnam stuff, you know, verisimilitude and accuracy. But I'm also like a writing thing. Like there are like 14 or 15 writers in a room. And at first you just talk about the story, the whole overall story for the season. And then you sort of start specializing. What's going to go first, second, third? And what will happen in the 5th episode? And then eventually, after a lot of talk, which goes, I've been back and forth to L.A., I don't know how many times, a lot. Then they're assigned to 2 writers for each episode who then take, okay, we're going to do that section. And then everybody reads it, then you change. It's like being at a really bad committee meeting where nobody knows much about whatever you're talking. Like it's like being with a bunch of officers in Vietnam. No offense. I was kidding about that. When you're a novelist or a story writer, you're a tyrant, and you're in control of everything. You're the costumer and the dialogue writer and the story writer, and you do the description. But I got to say, it's been a lot of fun because it is collaborative, and you make friends with these people, and you're all aiming to make something that in some way is at least kind of beautiful. You can't make, on NBC, you can't make it really beautiful. They don't let you because it's network television. You can do it on cable, but because you have sponsors and they don't want bad language in there and they don't want nasty things to happen, even though life is filled with them. They put kind of nastiness in, but they don't nasty it up enough. And so you feel like you forfeited a little bit of that, but it's been fun because we're trying to make something that's that's better than most stuff on television. And it's been fun.
We have time for...
I won't say I'll do it for the rest of my life, but it was fun for a while.
We have time for just one last question. So 2 things I'll say about it. 1, it's a little long, so I'm going to abbreviate it. It's from a teacher. And 2, remember that time earlier when you said we were friends? After I read this question, I hope we still are, because I know this is going to be a difficult one for you. What is the true story behind Kurt Lemon?
Behind Kurt Lemon? Oh, God. Yeah, this is going to be a downer to end here. I'll do it in a backwards way. Kurt Lemon is based on a real guy. His name was Alvin Chip Merricks. He was my best friend, black guy. I had his back, he had my back. And one day he stepped on a booby-trapped artillery round that blew him into a tree. I got over the hard part fast, along with another guy named Tom Markunis. They were killed by the same artillery round. If you know what artillery rounds are, you know what they will do to a human body. Chip was black, but you wouldn't know it by what was left of him. He was yellow and red and white bones and, little bits of black, but you wouldn't know. He was made into mush. And he was my best friend, and it will stay with me and haunt me forever. Just as the Vietnamese dad I talked about earlier will stay with me. It's not just because he was an American. It was because he was a human being. What really haunts me all these years later, on top of his death, and how it broke my heart, is the thought of his, let's say his mother, you know, waking up, 96-year-old woman waking up down in Orlando where Chip was from, and it's 2 in the morning, and she says, "Where's my baby? Where's my baby?" And her baby has been dead for 50 years. And you think of the tragedy is not just Chip's death, but those who loved him, his mom and dad and his brothers and sisters, and me, his buddy there, and he was a fun-loving, happy, smart, good guy, and a brave guy. And the tragedy spills over from the person to the people who are still grieving and suffering. And that's kind of what I tried to tell you about, that wars are not just about the soldiers, but they're about, in the end, all of us. Here aren't soldiers. Again, many thanks for coming, and good night.